Akai just released the APC Mini MK2 and the APC 25 MK2, updated versions of their budget controllers for Ableton Live. In this video, I'll take a look at what's new compared to the previous versions of both, then step back and take a beginner-friendly look at who they're for and what they do, and finally how they compare to other offerings on the market. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Akai sent these over for review, no money changed hands, and Akai have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded by supporters on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. You'll find a no-talking version of this song at the end of this video. Let's get started. Okay, I'll start with what's new with these Mark II controllers compared to the originals, and for those of you not familiar with this genre of controller, I'll say briefly that they are mainly designed for people who want to use Ableton Live in session view, to brainstorm track ideas, to launch clips and scenes, to manage a live performance or live loop into clips in various tracks. There will be a beginner-friendly introduction to these later on in the video, but I'll just say that if you're not interested in session view in live, there are better options you should consider, which I'll talk about later. So one of the biggest new things in both these controllers compared to the previous generation are that the pads now light up in full RGB as opposed to just shades of red, green, and yellow in the previous Mark I controllers. This means they more faithfully reflect the tracks and clips in your session, which is particularly important if you have a lot going on or are paging around in a large project. Also, when a track is armed, you'll see dimly lit red clips where the empty ones are, and that's where you can live loop into. The next two new big improvements are only in APC Mini MK2 compared to the Mark I. It now has new drum and note modes. In the new note mode, you can play melodies and chords. Using a note grid, the red pads point you to the root note, and rows are stacked on top of each other, letting you play increasingly higher notes. If you play the same note and it repeats itself across multiple rows, you'll see it highlighted. If you hit Shift and Note, you'll see a bunch of ways you can customize the grid. The colored pads represent different settings, and if you long press a pad, it'll show you what it does. So this, for example, transposes the whole grid, +3 octaves. 0, -1, -2, that's the bottom row. Then the next two rows select the scale. You can see representation of the scale in this sort of piano style keyboard up top. And if you long press a pad, it'll write the scale name. So major, melodic, minor, and this says chromatic, believe me. And you can also choose the root note up top. These pads let you choose the intervals between the rows. 3rd, 4th, 5th, up to an octave interval. And these intervals only work if you choose to hide the, here we go, to hide the non-scale notes. And if you do, if I go back to note mode, you can play an 8-octave range, which is pretty useful, I think. Like I mentioned, these intervals only work, at least as of the current firmware, if you choose to hide non-scale notes. If you show them, then it's one preset interval. It defaults to this, where each row is 8 semitones above the next one. I think they should offer an option, or at least default to one, which is every 5 semitones or every 4th as you go up. Kind of like how strings on a guitar are arranged, at least until you get to the B string. Also exclusive to APC Mini MK2 is its drum mode. This lets you control up to 64 pads per track, depending on how the pads are configured in the track. There are a few more minor differences between the Mark II and the Mark I APC Mini. The Mark II is slightly bigger. The fader caps are more comfortable to use and stick out more compared to these, but you might need to be a bit more careful if you throw the Mark II in your bag, as opposed to the Mark I, where the faders are more flush with the surface. One more small difference between this and the Mark I, the pads in all of these, by the way, aren't velocity sensitive, but they're a bit lighter to the touch here compared to the Mark I. Let's focus a bit on the APC 25 Mark II. I already mentioned the biggest visible difference between it and the APC 25 Mark I are that the pads are RGB, full color, as opposed to the green, yellow, red pads on the previous one. Beside that, velocity sensitivity has been improved, I'm told. I don't have the original, but this seems fine to me. More importantly, I think, the knobs have been swapped from pots to endless encoders, which I think is a good thing. So those are the key differences between the Mark II and the Mark I versions of both. If you're thinking of which of the two to get, I'd say that if you've already got a MIDI keyboard you're happy with and you have the space, get the APC Mini Mark II. But if you don't have a keyboard and 2 octaves of MIDI keys are enough for you, I think the APC Key25 Mark II is a great way to start exploring Ableton's grid. Even though it only has 5 rows of pads as opposed to 8 and they're more bunched up, this is still totally usable. It's also a great portable solution for all-in-one Ableton Live control. If you're thinking of knobs versus faders, it's more a matter of personal preference. Faders control levels more naturally and it's easier to perform live, I think, with several at a time overall compared to knobs. But most of the parameters you'll be controlling, pans, sends, and many device parameters, will typically be in the form of dials, so encoders may feel more natural. APC Mini does have one hands-on control advantage though, which is the 9th fader for master level control, which APC Key25 does not. However, Key25 more than compensates for that with transport controls, including shift and record, which activates Ableton Live's capture MIDI function. There's no direct transport control on APC Mini, but if you've got things going on, you can quickly stop all the clips by holding shift and stop all clips. That doesn't stop the overall transport though, so it's still going on in the background. One final pro for choosing the APC Mini Mark II is its drum and note scale modes. Again, the pads aren't velocity sensitive, so you'll still get only one velocity level. And of course you can play drums with velocity sensitivity with a keyboard, but I think it's fun to try out different scales in note mode to change things up a bit as opposed to just piano style keys. Okay, so that's what's new about the APC Mini Mark II and the APC Key25 Mark II. We'll talk about pros and cons compared to alternatives in a bit, but for those of you not familiar with the basics of what these can do, first, in terms of overall setup, there shouldn't be any. Hooking them up to Live is pretty easy. There's only one USB port in the back and Live should auto-detect either controller and get its script up and running. If things are working as they should, you'll see a window on the grid. Here we've got 2 of them because I've got both controllers connected, and you can move this window, this view into the grid around just by holding shift and moving the arrows. And if you've gone all the way to the top, then this LED won't light up. If you've gone all the way to the left, and this LED won't light up. If for some reason you don't see these windows, go ahead and enter the preferences and look for the control surfaces to be active as well as the input and output. One more important thing, as long as we're here, if you go with the APC Key25, this doesn't matter because the knobs will pick up any parameter from where it's at. But if you choose the APC Mini, then the takeover mode is extremely important. Let me show you why. Let's go for the default, which is this. If I move the faders to control volume levels, you'll see that, say, if I move this fader all the way down, the minute I touch the volume fader here, it'll jump right up, which will cause an abrupt and probably unplanned change if you're in a performance. The way to solve this problem is to go into the settings and choose either one of these. I don't like pickup that much, but I love how value scaling works. So here, let's move this back all the way down. If I touch this fader just a bit, then the fader will quickly go up and very smoothly catch up to the physical position of the fader. So that's what you need to know about setup. I already talked about the drum and note modes, so I won't repeat that. Using the grid is pretty easy. You saw me do this in the intro. You just press the clip to launch it. And then these buttons on the bottom have a few functions based on what you choose here. So I could have them in stop clip mode, stop the active clip. And if we get a lot going on, these buttons launch scenes, by the way, when you're not using shift. Then in solo mode, we can solo tracks and solo a few tracks if we want. And in mute mode, mute tracks, record arm, multiple ARM tracks for recording. And one thing you should know here about Live, let me stop this. You can see that I can ARM more than one track for recording at a time, where the whole grid turns red. If you just want to ARM one track at a time, right-click any one of these and turn off or uncheck ARM exclusive, and only one track will be ARMed at a time. And select mode lets you quickly select tracks. Things are identical on the APC 25, works exactly the same way. Of course, the benefit here is you just select a track and you can play it. There's no sustain pedal input in the back, unfortunately, but there is a sustain button, so you can sustain notes that way. Transport is straightforward, start, stop. I already mentioned shift record is capture MIDI, octaves up and down, and reset. And then record turns on overdub if you're in the session view. And if you're in arrangement, then it turns on the arrangement record. Speaking of arrangement, the pads aren't that relevant unless you're recording a session into an arrangement. I made a whole tutorial about this and many more things in Ableton Live. I'll link to that below. But the transport, keys, and knobs obviously work whether you're in session or in arrangement view. Speaking of the knobs and the faders, they have 4 modes as well. So in volume mode, they control the volume of the tracks. In pan mode, they control panning, left and right, and obviously here as well. Pan, left and right. Sends will let you control the sends, and you can swap the send you're controlling by tapping this again and again. So tap number 1, we're controlling this first, the reverb send. And let's activate this track. That's the reverb send, then tap it again. We're controlling the delay send. You can't see which one you're controlling, so you might have to play with this a bit. And if you add more sends, then you can flip through those as well. Then finally, in device mode, you're controlling the device parameters. I notice that it takes a few turns to go through the whole range, and there's no way to change how fast this affects parameters. There are no settings or controller settings for either of these. There's no way to move between devices using the controller. Unfortunately, you need to select a device, then this little blue hand shows up, and then you're controlling that device's parameters. When it's devices like these, you might not know which parameter you're controlling until you start playing with it, which is why in this case I created a macro over here. I've grouped these two, and this lets me control their parameters, the parameters that I want in one place. So in this case, both the oscillators of massive, but also the echo, of course, with these knobs as well. If you're using a plugin, let's maybe go into here to Piano V2, then just open this up, hit configure, and choose, let's say maybe open. So I'll shift Windows a bit here to show you this. Anyway, you hit configure, then choose the first 8 parameters that you want to control. Let's say these guys, and you can't see this, but they've now shown up here. Let's maybe add a couple more. And now, as long as the little blue hand is here, I can control these parameters. This obviously works for the faders as well. So this was a long way of saying these only control the first 8 parameters in a device, but you can work around that to choose which parameters you want, whether using configure for plugins or racks or groups for multiple plugins at a time. So let's talk a bit about pros and cons. First, compared to other controllers, you might not see features which increasingly we're seeing in other controllers, like an arpeggiator or sequencer, or even a settings app to configure the controllers. However, since their stated goal is to work with Ableton Live, Live has an arpeggiator. Obviously, it's a sequencer. And say if you'd like to configure the velocity curve, you can do that with the velocity MIDI effect. But if your priority is to see and control a big as window as possible into Ableton Live's session grid, whether with additional faders or knobs and a keyboard, These two are probably the best budget game in town. There are some alternatives though. On the grid-only side, Novation's LaunchPad Mini puts up a good fight at a similar price point and has customizable modes which make it a bit more versatile controller for things beyond just Ableton Live. There's no customization or templates in either of the APCs, but the trade-off is obviously that LaunchPad Mini doesn't have physical faders in the case of the comparison to APC Mini. You can map virtual faders on these pads, but these don't travel along with the grid, at least not for LaunchPad Mini. Novation does start to have an edge with velocity-sensitive and pressure-sensitive pads on the LaunchPad X and the LaunchPad Pro, and virtual faders that do map along to the grid and move along as you move around with the arrow keys. The X and Pro also have send controls, again, that travel with the grid window and the tracks you select. And if you have a bigger budget, the LaunchPad Pro also adds a multi-track sequencer and even more controls, but those do come at a higher cost and certainly isn't in the low price range of these two. Then at the high end of the budget is obviously Push 2, the ultimate Ableton Live grid controller, but again, way more expensive than either of these. On the keyboard side, at a similar price point, Novation's LaunchKey Mini is the closest competitor. It has more built-in features like a generative arpeggiator and velocity-sensitive pads, but its view into the grid is much smaller, 2 rows instead of 5. Focusing on the APC Key25, it's the only keyboard controller with a grid that's this big, which makes it pretty unique. But again, if clip launching isn't important to you, or you get a different clip launcher, then features that don't exist here that might be important to you are a sustain pedal input, velocity-sensitive pads, though of course fewer of them, a built-in arpeggiator and sequencer, which is important if you want to use hardware gear or if you just want to brainstorm quickly with software instruments. There's no aftertouch here. These keys are only velocity-sensitive, and increasingly we're seeing controllers with small screens that let you configure parameters or see which parameter it is you're controlling. With controllers like these, you need to look at the screen to see the values of parameters move as you change them. So that's it for the Mark IIs of APC Mini and Key25. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.